Okay, and just confirming we are now live.
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Liz Koslov. I'm excited to be here moderating this session featuring youth voices for climate. As I think we're all aware, hopefully the youth movement for climate action and climate justice has, really literally changed the world. When I first, not super long ago, began learning and teaching about climate change, I remember asking students in one of the first classes I taught how often they talked about climate change with their family, with their friends, as part of everyday life. And the answer was almost never. And that has changed enormously. Now when I'm teaching, it's the opposite. And, far outside the classroom, on the streets, all over the world, students and young people are demanding that not only do we start talking about climate change, we actually finally start doing something about it. And the plans and the policies and the visions that youth leaders like Ariana Khan and Xiye Bastida, who we'll hear from today, the plans that they're creating and mobilizing and organizing around are not the kind of small, incremental, let the market try to fix it climate policies of old. They're radical, they're transformative, and in that they're realistic. They recognize the scale of the problem, the intersectionality of the crisis that we face. And I'm just absolutely thrilled that we have a chance to learn from Ariana and Xiye's work as part of this conference. You can read their full bios on the session page. And, we don't have a very long time today, but we'll hear from each of them for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to Q&A for any time we have left. So with that, let me turn it over to our first speaker, Ariana Khan.
Hi everyone, my name is Aryaana. I'm currently calling in from the second tallest mountain in Massachusetts. I did a part of the Appalachian Trail as training to lead other young people across this in a few weeks. Before I talk about all of that, I just want to give some background on where I'm from and how that's informed all the work I do now. So I was born and raised in Bangladesh, and I moved to New York in 2010. Growing up in Bangladesh, I witnessed annual floods firsthand. I grew up in the capital city, so it's one of the most densely populated cities in the world. And growing up in Dhaka, I still have to experience this disproportionate climate impact, like going to school in the midst of flooding, or not going to school for weeks at a time because of the flooding. When my little brother was born with a heart defect, the doctors did not release him from the hospital for a month because the air outside would have literally killed him. For context, that was the same air that I had been breathing my whole life. And I didn't really know that was a problem until I moved to New York. So when I moved to New York, I thought that I had left behind all of these extreme climate impacts, whether that is the air pollution or flooding. But then Hurricane Sandy happened within a few years. What I remember from that was not going to school again, just like I had not in Bangladesh, because our public transportation system, the subways, got boarded up because of Hurricane Sandy. And my friends in Far Rockaway literally lost their homes to the floods. And like especially other folks who lived really close to the shoreline, they were really disproportionately impacted, and they're still rebuilding from that. So over the years, I really started looking for a connected thread between my experiences in Bangladesh and my experiences in New York. And I realized that it was this overwhelming issue of climate change, and it wasn't something that I was learning about in school. I had to go seek out outside programs and nonprofit organizations who were teaching young people about
Hopefully Ariana will be back in 1 second.
environmental science and climate justice minority groups who are ethnically Bengali, but they
I'm giving Ariana's connection a minute. She might try turning off her video.
they are hi. Hello.
We can hear you.
Okay, perfect. What was the last thing you guys heard?
You're talking about in Far Rockaway, people still rebuilding.
Hi.
Hi, you're back. Do you want to try without your video?
Yes, I'm going to turn my video off.
Okay.
Again, I'm sorry. What was the last?
It's okay. It's the new conference life.
Unfortunately, well, hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm still rebuilding from Hurricane Sandy, but I just want to speak a bit more about my work in Bangladesh.
Okay, I think while Ariana fixes her connection, maybe she'll try calling back in. Xiye, do you mind jumping in for a bit and then hopefully we'll get Ariana back?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, thank you.
And I hope she can join us because her story is amazing. She's done so much work. So hopefully, you all get to hear about the work that she's done. But yeah, I'll start with basically the same kind of story background that Ariana was talking about, which is my own personal experience with the climate crisis and how that has informed the work that I do today. So I was born and raised in San Pedro Tultepec, which is a small town west from Mexico City. And I grew up in an indigenous focused community, which meant that I grew up with a philosophy of taking care of Mother Earth and just taking care of our environment as a way of living our lives. So when I started to see all of the disconnect that we as humans had with the world around us, I just couldn't believe it. And I think that happens to a lot of us. We grow up seeing the world a certain way. And when that way is challenged, it's really hard to grapple with it. For me, the way in which I was seeing Mother Earth be disrespected was through pollution caused by factories, mega projects that would come in, like trains and build over aquifers, and Mexico City taking water away from our community to fulfill their water needs, leaving us waterless. And a lot of these things were just, an everyday occurrence. So, and I think I still didn't have the knowledge or the experience to criticize these practices. And then in 2015, when I was 13 years old, my hometown suffered from flooding. And that was the first time in which I ever saw a natural disaster happen. I know that people have seen, hurricanes, wildfires, but for me, these were all very far away things that I never thought I would have to see firsthand. And I didn't really connect it with the climate crisis until a couple years after, when I attended the World Urban Forum in Kuala Lumpur, which is a United Nations event, which focuses on how to build cities and how to make cities evolve. And in every single conference at the World Urban Forum, people were talking about how we need to make cities more resilient to the climate crisis, how we need to make them resilient to sea level rise, and how we need to basically adapt to a changing world. And I also spoke at that event and talked about my town and my experience and the importance of including indigenous knowledge when we are developing towns. I gave the example that a university was built in a neighboring town, and the architects never asked about the knowledge from the local peoples about how that land behaved. And the university actually sank, and it's an unfinished project right now. So that's just a small example of a lot of the things that we have to think about when we think about rebuilding and adapting to the climate crisis. But in reality, what I really want to bring to you today is my realization after having experienced that, and after moving to New York City, seeing the effects of Hurricane Sandy, even though I moved here 3 years after Hurricane Sandy hit, my realization that the climate crisis is a social justice issue because it impacts marginalized communities the most. Because the systems that perpetuate the climate crisis, the fossil fuel industry, are already displacing indigenous communities. They're already contaminating our water and our air. And most of the conservation efforts that we have been familiar with for the past 5 decades are all centered around caging nature in and keeping humans out of it. When in reality, we know that we can live in coexistence with Mother Earth if we want to. Indigenous peoples protect over 80% of the world's biodiversity, and they're only 5% of the world's population. So I think that when we talk about managed retreat, when we talk about what it means to build back or rebuild or even prepare for for crises to come, we need to recognize that it needs to be done with a holistic approach. And in 2019, there were 24.9 million displacements caused by weather-related hazards. By 2050, there will be 1 billion people affected by the climate crisis. Tens of thousands of people have been displaced by wildfires in California. And I think we make the mistake of thinking about managed retreat as just a sea level rise issue, when in reality it's all of these front lines, wildfires, pollution that makes places unlivable, even hurricanes. And what we need to understand when we are thinking about how we adapt to this is that it cannot be done unless we have a social justice lens. And I've seen, preparing for this conference today, I was watching a lot of videos about how, especially in rich areas, specifically talking about people who can afford buying houses on the beach or at the coastline, when politicians come and tell their constituents that they are going to have to move away from there, that they're going to have to sell their houses, and they're going to have to not be able to live on the beach anymore, people say, but I haven't seen the effects of the climate crisis, so why do I have to leave my house? And what we need to understand is that if you want to wait until you see the effects of the climate crisis, that means that there are already islands underwater. That means that there are already communities like the Ninth Ward in New Orleans.
5 o'clock.
Apologize for that. My computer says the time every hour. That means that there are communities in New Orleans who are already underwater and who have been facing this since Hurricane Katrina and before. That means that there's already places that have been made unlivable because we didn't draw down carbon fast enough, because we didn't stop our emissions fast enough, so that you could see the effects, so that you could be convinced to move out of the place that you already know is going to be underwater. So especially for something like the climate crisis, we need to bring our humanity into the solutions. With a lot of international relations, a lot of local policy, a lot of national policy, especially something like the climate crisis, can be heavily politicized. And we cannot afford that to happen. I think specifically us as the Youth Climate Movement, I personally helped organize the New York City climate strike, which brought over 300,000 people to the streets in 2019. We cannot see climate targets that are 2050. We cannot see climate targets that are 2075. We want to see climate targets that are close, climate targets that are set for 2030, for 2045, so that we know that that our main issue won't be managed retreat, that our main focus has to be the mitigation, not adaptation. Obviously, both are really important, but how can we actually prevent a lot of the conflicts that are going to come from climate migration, a lot of the conflicts that are going to come from having to close borders or deciding whether to close borders or not? And I read this article that was published by Harvard saying that what we need in terms of managed retreat is increased transparency. We need to increase transparency and tell people the exact effects of the climate crisis in their region. We need to have an emphasis on relocation, which is actually really hard for communities who are tied to the land and whose culture is tied to the land. But we cannot just build walls and then, walls won't last forever, and then have people face a crisis that is much more dangerous than just having moved earlier. We need to have an explicit emphasis on social inequality. We need to think about long-term and large-scale holistic approaches. And most importantly, participatory pre-disaster planning, actually bringing your community into decisions. that have to do with their future and their relocation. So yeah, that's what I can say about this very issue that is hard for us to think about as climate activists, because we're trying to prevent this from happening at all, but we have to accept that it will happen. And I think that when it comes to imagining a better future, we have to think about building cities and building communities that are going to be resistant, resilient, inclusive, and yeah, just protect communities as much as possible.
Thank you so much, Xiye, for those comments. I have so many thoughts. Ariana, are you back?
I'm back. Just let me know if I cut out again. I'm so sorry.
Okay,
but
no worries.
I really want to thank Xiye for one, sharing their story, and two, just want to piggyback of what was said about the intersections of like social justice and managed retreat and how we move forward. So I've done a lot of work with vulnerable communities such as the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh or communities in Puerto Rico. Two very different places of the world, but a lot of the lived experiences are very similar because of the geography and because of the folks having their identities tied to the land. So the Rohingya are an ethnic minority living in Myanmar, but they're ethnically Bengali. They were taken there as indentured servants when the British colonized the Indian subcontinent. Right now, they're fleeing persecution in Myanmar, and a lot of the established refugee camps are in Cox's Bazar, which has the world's largest beach. Granted, the Rohingya refugee camps aren't by the beach; they are actually high up on the mountains. And one of the climate impacts that they are vulnerable to, and even happened a few months ago, were fires from extremely dry seasons. And it just really goes to show that folks who are already vulnerable to persecution and other social justice issues have to deal with climate change first and foremost. And I got to spend some time in the refugee camps, just hearing their stories, already surviving like the traumas and the violence of persecution, and then coming to a safe place, but then having to survive the effects of climate change. Just hearing about that was a lot. The makeshift, like witnessing the makeshift shelters in real time, that it really does we have to like emphasize those folks and their stories and their lived experiences when we try to come up with plans for managed retreat. As for my work in Puerto Rico, one of the phenomena that like I want to highlight is climate gentrification, and I think Xiye was kind of touching up on that. So one thing about climate change is that, one, if you don't think that it's happening right now, then that comes from a lot of privilege. But two, if we are able to survive like the effects first and foremost, then that means it's usually happening at the expense of like indigenous communities. So climate gentrification in Puerto Rico looks a lot like mainland Americans moving onto the island, displacing the local communities who are unable to afford rebuilding from like events like Hurricane Maria. And so you have the native population leaving, and folks, that could afford like living in places that are safer from the floods. Granted, like nowhere on an island is safe from climate change. It's just a matter of time. But folks that are relatively safer are, usually inhabited by folks with more privilege and like folks that can afford to like live there. And in both these cases, whether you are already a refugee or whether you're about to be a refugee or about to be displaced from a land, you have to like understand how solutions can sometimes have both pros and cons. So like when it comes to managing coastal lines, right? Like we have to question who is being centered amidst those plans, and how can we make sure that the voices that are centered are getting the resources that they need to stay there or come up with solutions that actually work for the local communities. And definitely like reflecting on my own experiences with immigration, having lived in Bangladesh, I didn't realize that part of the reason my family had to move here was because, like the villages that like we come from are actually going underwater. Like even though I had lived through floods firsthand, I didn't realize growing up that, like there wasn't actually a choice in moving. And inevitably, a lot of people who live in these places will have to move and will have to like figure out different ways to live. So in our like plans to adapt, how can we now go back to those folks and like center those voices and their stories? Is pretty much what I'm like dedicating my work to. And I think working in the youth climate movement, I'm definitely realizing that young people have innovative solutions. Part of the reason why I'm like trying to on like a mountain right now is because I'm like trying to figure out my connection to the land here. Ultimately, I'm not from this part of the world, but how can we all connect to the lands we call home now? And how can we, help others connect as well? So in a few weeks, I'll be leading a group of like 8 young people in the same trail that I'm doing right now. And hopefully we can all figure out ways to really just be like to be connected with the places we're from and figure out solutions for the future.
Thank you so much, Ariana. We have about 6 minutes left, so if there are questions that you all have, please drop them in the Q&A. Hopefully we'll have time for 1 or 2. I mean, I'm struck by so much of what you both had said. I feel like you've answered the question I had, which was kind of about, from your own experience, what you feel are essential, elements of any conversation about retreat or any kind of policy that's seeking to address displacement, migration, or the need for relocation in the context of climate change. And I think, Ariana, the way you ended, when we think about retreat, it's often focused on kind of a severing of connection to land. It's focusing, in Xiye, your words, on places that have been made unlivable. I think that's so crucial to stress. This is not a natural kind of inevitable occurrence that people are having their connections to land severed, are losing places that they are tied to and their communities are tied to. And how can, retreat and managed retreat and this conversation, policies that follow, really be about making livable, about reconnecting, drawing connections to one another, making the kinds of movements that are happening in many different parts of the world in many different ways part of a broader movement for climate action, for climate justice, for a more livable future. And I think these are really open and tough questions, in part because the experiences are, very personal, very local, very traumatic of being exposed to these sorts of events, having to move, having to think about having these conversations. And so, the work that you're doing and the way that you're telling these stories, I think illustrates how broader connections can start to be forged and how we can think about these experiences as part of a larger context. And so, I would just invite you, if you have, comments based on hearing from one another, if you have other thoughts that have come up in response to, this question of kind of how do we make these conversations about retreat, which I think have both been very separate from, as many adaptation conversations are, very separate from acknowledging climate change or talking about mitigation or talking about how do we prevent this from happening in the first place, but also pretty disconnected from climate movements. How do we sort of bring these together, or, make retreat something that maybe looks a bit more like making livable as opposed to just admitting unlivability and going with that.
Well, I actually thought that what Ariana said about finding your connection to the land in a place where you're not from was really striking, because I hadn't thought about it that way. Because I'm also not from this part of the world, right? I'm half Chilean, half Mexican, so I'm actually from like the other end as well. And I think that we just have to recognize, and this is part of our work as climate activists and as part of making the climate movement what it should be, we have to recognize kind of our duty to protecting the world as a whole, not only our own places of living and our own homes. So it's not only about how do we build a wall in Lower Manhattan to protect the financial district, it's about how do we, protect the people in New York City as a whole, and how do my actions here impact people across the world, and how does my consumption impact the work industry in other countries. And so I think that holistic way of looking at things as being interconnected is one of the breakthroughs that we're having in the past 2 or 3 years when talking about climate. Because when we talk about management and retreat and relocation, we have to think about everything else that constitutes a society. So how are we dealing with the patriarchy, and how are we bringing feminist solutions, and how we are, bettering our education systems, and how we are building resiliency and community. So it's not only about moving communities, but actually making them, worth it for people to move and everything. So those are just some of my thoughts, but I think that's a very beautiful concept, Ariana.
Thank you, Xiye. And I just want to say that the work you do is incredible. And yeah, like you said, we are all trying to find, I guess, our connections to a land that we're not from. And all of us are trying to make homes in places that we might not be from, or we might not know the history of. But part of growing, whether it is an individual level or on a societal level, is acknowledging those histories and acknowledging those connections and moving forward. Like, definitely the rest of my life is going to be just dealing with my past traumas around climate change, but also like solutions around climate change from every angle possible. So whether that's simply having these conversations that you and I are having, or doing academic research, or just going to a trail and then helping to lead other people on that trail, both metaphorically and literally, is something that all of us can do to come up with solutions and to just move forward in a way that we haven't necessarily done before, or maybe we lost our way somewhere along in the past. But that's where learning about the history and learning about the different lands we're in really comes in.
Thank you both so much. Thank you for your work. Thank you for sharing your experiences and your stories and your knowledge today. And I'm so excited to follow, the work you continue to do. And I hope we can all find ways to be part of it. So thanks so much, and be well.
Thank you for having us.